Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining AIDR and the Collaborating for Inclusion Research team, Ivy and Michelle, are with us today for this very important final webinar in our series on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Margaret Morton. I'm the Executive Director for the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and it is my great pleasure to be your host today. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm standing, the Wurundjeri people here in Naarm. I'm standing in Melbourne on a traditional wintry day for Melbourne. It's gloomy and grey and has been raining, but I love it, so here we are. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the various lands on which you're all joining us from today. And I particularly pay respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connection to the land, the sea and the waters across Australia. So as is our tradition, let's begin with a few housekeeping notes. Today's event, as you can see, is supported by Auslan Interpretation, and I welcome our interpreters and thank them very much. The event will also be recorded, so the recording can be made available afterwards. We'll be using the Q&A. Now, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar, there are two features on the recording that I want you to pay attention to. The Q&A feature is where we take questions. So please, as you're listening, if you've got a question, pop it in the Q&A and I'll do my best to get to the key questions at the end of the seminar. You're all able to upvote questions so that I know which ones are the most popular. But there's a second feature, which is the chat, and I can see that a number of you are already using the chat to say hello to each other. Feel free to acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land where you are from. And just say hello and comment. I would encourage you to share thoughts and reflections in the chat as we go. That's often a really useful part of the experience. Just remember that if you're wanting to share with everybody, you do need to choose everyone from the drop-down menu. And please keep all of your chat respectful and respectful to both one another and also to our presenters. So I think that does the logistics. Any questions, pop them in the chat as well for logistics, and my team will answer them as we go. So to today's topic. Over the last year, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience has been working in partnership with Collaborating for Inclusion, and it's been a wonderful partnership, I have to say. They are based at the University of Sydney at the Impact Centre for Disability Research and Policy, and we have hosted together the Leave Nobody Behind webinar series. So today is the fourth in the sequence in the series and the final one. So far, though, we've taken a deep dive into different perspectives of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. We've looked at emergency services and government. We've looked at people living with disability, and we've looked at community services that support people with disability. Following all of that, AIDR supported the team at Collaborating for Inclusion, and they ran a national forum, a wonderful occasion to bring all of those three perspectives together. Since the forum, the Collaborating for Inclusion research team have developed a disability inclusive disaster risk reduction framework and toolkit for collaborative action, and that's today's topic. Over the next hour, we will demonstrate through Michelle's wonderful process of taking us through both of those. We will demonstrate the framework itself and the purpose-built tools that enable development of cross-sector collaborative disability inclusive disaster risk reduction policy and practice. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Michelle Villeneuve. Michelle is the Deputy Director at the Centre for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney, and she'll take us through the framework and talk more about it. Welcome, Michelle.
There we go. Thanks so much, Margaret, for that warm introduction. Welcome everyone to today's really exciting occasion to share the DIDRR Framework and Toolkit for Collaborative Action with everybody. I'm calling in today from the lands of the Gadigal people, and I'd first like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging leaders from the Aboriginal community, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people who are joining us here today. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming, those of you in and outside of Australia who are eager to hear more about what we've learned and how we've built this toolkit through partnership. Margaret's already described who I am and what I do, and I'll just describe a little bit about what I look like in case there are people online who might like a visual description. I'm a white female with blue eyes and sort of medium length brown hair. I won't talk much about the gray that you can see at the front. And I'm wearing a blue jumper with a white collared shirt. I am in the background with me are some palm leaves blowing, and I have the luxury today of having the sun shining on my back while I talk to you today. I'd also like, before I start, to just, it's not possible to recognize the amount of effort and contributions by so many people, but I suppose in short, I would like to really extend my appreciation to the research team. The research team at Collaborating for Inclusion that supports me in everything that I do is comprised of postdoctoral fellows, including fellows with lived experience of disability, who are leading research in their own rights on lived experience and disability inclusion and are contributing to this research. And also a key research fellow, Jade Chang, who's been really instrumental in supporting much of the survey work that we've done on this project in our national survey findings, among numerous other work. And we're really thankful for her background as a health economist contributing to the research. Ivy Yen is our project manager who keeps us together across all of our projects, and we're supported by a number of research assistants. And many of you will know Parvati Subramaniam through your interactions and contact with her in the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Certificate course. But there are many others as well supporting this work, including co-researchers with lived experience of disability. We also have had involvement of a number of support staff, including the support staff at the Center for Disability Research and Policy, and our colleagues who provide us with much support, advice, and critical input along the way and along the journey. And I should also mention that accompanying us and supporting the next generation of leadership in this space are PhD students and honors research students who have all contributed in diverse ways to the development of this program of research over time. More importantly, maybe I should even mention that a number of people who are online today who will be watching this later and who live, work, and play in many regions of Australia have supported this, the development of this framework, our collaborations and partnerships over a decade of development of DIDRR. So I really want to extend my thanks and appreciation to people with disability, the services that support people with disability, family, friends, carers, and allies, the emergency services sector, both the service providers and government, and so many different organizations that provide routine care and support across our communities have been instrumental in the development of this work. Next slide, please. I think we need to start with the idea that everybody needs an emergency plan. And this is really one of the larger problems that this research sought to investigate. When we say everybody, we mean everybody. Individuals need a plan, each and every one of us. Organizations across our community need a plan, and our communities need plans to support community level action. We're going to discuss today how these plans all are interconnected. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing the DIDRR Framework and Toolkit, and as I walk you through it today, I'll show and share images on the slide that are pictures of sections of the framework and toolkit. On this slide, there's a picture of one of our disability inclusive emergency planning forums with a number of people with and without disability from the different roles that I just mentioned, sitting around a table engaging in person-centered conversations about community level planning and risks that people with disability face in emergencies. In part one of the framework, we really introduced the research and the background to the work that we've done over the last decade. We talk about who the framework is for. And who is this framework for? It is for all of you. It's for all of us. It's for everybody so that we can learn to work together to share responsibility. We need to do that because of the disproportionate risks that people with disability face in emergency situations. There are a number of reasons that people with disability face those risks, but the deepest and most important one that we need to manage head on is the stigma and discrimination that excludes people with disabilities and puts them at greater risk than the rest of the population. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, how we learn and work together to help from each of our roles and each of our perspectives to come together, share responsibility, and reduce that risk. In earlier webinars, we talked about why disability sits in the too hard basket. And so I really hope that you'll go back to watch those if you haven't seen them, or return to revisit some of the concepts that we introduced in the earlier part of this webinar series. In this part of the series, we're going to really talk about that responsibility sharing and how do we start to manage holding on to what we call the, instead of the hot potato pass, holding on to that hot potato a little bit longer and thinking about what is our role and what is our responsibility in disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. Part one will also share how this framework was developed, and it will introduce the key questions that drive our research forward. Namely, how do we enable people with disability to take control of their own emergency preparedness while also ensuring their rights to protection and safety are met? On this slide, you'll see a number line and a light bulb at the year 2015, where we began this work, knowing that we had some general principles around disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, but no tools to really realize what those principles needed to look like and how we needed to action them in practice. We asked particular questions about who takes responsibility for the support needs of people with disability in emergencies. How should that support be organized and delivered? And how will the responsibilities of different stakeholders be guided and outcomes measured? The biggest challenge when we started this work was first off knowing what people with disability can do for themselves and what supports they need before, during, and after emergencies. So that's really where this research and this collaboration began. Next slide, please. By 2021, we had made some significant changes, influencing policy and embedding disability inclusive disaster risk reduction principles into policy guidance and documents. And on that slide, there are a number of frameworks from the international to the national to the jurisdictional level that have all started to embrace and embed the research findings as we've traveled on this journey since 2015. A key part of our learning process was making sure that government decision makers were involved at all levels, despite the fact that our efforts and energy was at the grassroots in and with community, learning and working together. We needed to make sure we channeled those findings up to the highest levels of government to support their learning, working together, and decision making. And as you can see by this slide, we've made some significant inroads to supporting instrumental policy change. Next slide, please. Our phases for the development of DIDRR are best broken down, I think, into these three stages. The first was really about figuring out what DIDRR involves and guiding government and emergency services in its development. The second part was really focused on understanding the roles and responsibilities, as well as the contributions of different stakeholders who weren't traditionally or typically invited or involved in disaster risk reduction, management, and planning. And that included people with disability, carers, so informal and unpaid support providers, as well as paid and formal support providers. Our focus was on trying to understand what role and contribution can they make, and feasibly, what steps can they take in disaster risk reduction. Now, I would say that we're in a phase of building cross-sector capability. And we've probably been there since 2020, and I think that that phase will still be ongoing as more people embrace disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, learn and use the tools and embed them into their practices across communities. Right now, our focus has been on creating new and different ways to learn and work together. And in our toolkit that we'll share today, we'll show the evaluation of some of those new ways of learning together. I suppose the next step in our process on this journey, if we think about that arrow and moving forward into the future, our next reasonable and logical steps will be about how do we build the data and evidence, and how do we build that into systems and structures that help us to make informed decisions? And how will we know, when we've arrived at leadership in inclusive disaster risk reduction? Next slide, please. It's important to understand the process that we went through. You're listening to me talk about the process today, but I hope that on the slides, you'll see evidence of the depth and level of engagement at all levels with all of the different stakeholders. And we achieve that through a knowledge to action co-production process. A simple way to put that is participatory and action-oriented research. But it's a little bit more dynamic than that, I suppose. It's not just about observing, reflecting, and acting. It's a combination of inquiring, synthesizing, and co-producing tools together. And that's overlaid by an appreciative inquiry set of processes where we unpack what's working now and what's working well. We try to identify the best of what's working so that we can amplify and grow the best of what is, and design and develop new ways of working together to fill gaps in practices that aren't quite developed or need further investigation. So this process of turning knowledge to action is really important when initiatives are new, when the knowledge base is underdeveloped. And that was definitely the case for disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. On our knowledge to action process, at the bottom of that funnel where we're inquiring, synthesizing, and co-producing so that we can tailor knowledge, we're doing that for a key reason. We're doing that to produce tools that everybody can use. There's an arrow in the center of that slide, an orange arrow that points to 5 tools for action that we'll focus on in today's webinar and that you can learn more about in the framework and toolkit itself. 2 of them are really critical foundational tools: the person-centered emergency preparedness framework and process tool, and the disability inclusive emergency planning forums or process as well. The other 3, the person-centered emergency preparedness certificate course, the person-centered emergency preparedness or PSEP Connect learning communities, and ESDA, which it stands for Emergency Sector Disability Awareness. Those really become capacity development strategies and tools to support stakeholders on their learning journey toward disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And we'll share a bit more about each one of those. Next slide, please. Importantly, in our process was having a place where people could access those tools, use them, provide feedback, and help us to strengthen and develop them and make them better. And so that place is called Collaborating4Inclusion.org. And we invite you to visit the website routinely and regularly to find out what's new and what's there. We add information as we go, and we improve resources along the way. So you'll always find new information or more current and updated versions of the resources that we've built. This is where you can find everything that you need. Next slide, please. Now, I want to just really anchor this conversation today by saying it's really critical to think about the interoperability of person-centered emergency preparedness. So working at the individual level to develop our own personal emergency preparedness plans tailored to our unique support needs, situation, and risk circumstances, and communicated with the people who will actually be there in an emergency situation. That needs to be the starting point for all of us, whether we have disabilities or not. And people with disability will greatly benefit from the process steps in that person-centered toolkit, because it will help them to tailor to the different support needs they need and the different ways they need to manage and navigate those supports with different people in their lives to make sure that they have a plan that can be implemented together and in partnership with the people that support them. But PSEP won't work alone, and it can't work in a vacuum. So our research has demonstrated the critical importance of having the same type of conversation, but at a community level. And that's disability inclusive emergency planning. So disability inclusive emergency planning forums are a very structured way to bring different stakeholders who don't typically learn and work together to come into conversation, to have hard conversations about the extra support needs or the requirements that people with disability have in emergency situations, and to first listen and learn, and then deliberate and understand, and then begin to prioritize and plan how we're going to change the situation to increase safety and well-being outcomes for people with disability. Those conversations become not just about people with disability, but all groups considered at greater risk in disaster situations. And having that community level conversation becomes quite transformative, because when we start to learn about the support needs of people with disability in emergencies, it provokes or unveils the kinds of supports that lots of different people have across community. And it can really strengthen whole of community planning when we think and take the perspective of people with disability and learn together with them. We'll talk a little bit more about those forums and guide you to some resources, but in the middle of this slide is the word organizational. And I think it's really important to recognize that community, disability, social welfare, disability advocacy, disability representative organizations, all of the different types of organizations that provide human services and support across our community are really critical to this process. And I think I would be remiss if I said they weren't also left behind in disaster risk reduction. It's important to recognize and include organizations, really understand the critical role that they play in supporting that link between individual level preparedness and community level planning. They become a critical bridge in this process. And we'll talk a little bit more about the roles, the important roles of organizations in this space too. Next slide, please. This slide shows part 2 of the framework. We're beyond the introduction now, and I'll move into what part 2 is about. It's about DIDRR. So what is DIDRR? What are the mechanisms within which we can implement it? And what are the principles that might drive our working and learning together? That's what part 2 of the DIDRR Framework and Toolkit is all about. DIDR is really about making sure people with disability and their support needs are at the center of our thinking, of our planning, and of our actions whenever we're engaged, before, during, and after disasters, in keeping communities safe. It means specifically for people with disability, making sure that we protect the rights of people with disability to safety and well-being in emergencies, that we ensure that they're included and have a seat at the table and are meaningful participants in driving decisions and actions. This is really critical because people with disability know the situations that create uncertainty for them every day, and they understand deeply what that will mean in an emergency situation. It means that their voice is the most powerful in helping us to understand what can we do about that to support safety and well-being for everyone. This part of the framework will talk about collaborative principles. Collaborative principles because disability inclusive disaster risk reduction can only happen when all of the different stakeholder groups come to learn and work together. While DIDRR is a human right, and it must start with capabilities, it needs collaborative action to work effectively. So that means we all need to learn and figure out how we're going to define and refine our roles in relation to ensuring the outcomes of safety and well-being for people with disability in emergencies, and to making sure that their voice is meaningfully included right from the beginning. Next slide, please. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on what is in part 2 of this framework, because it's the kinds of questions that come up routinely in webinars and seminars that we have around DIDRR. At the top of this slide, it says, how can we shift from vulnerability to capability thinking? So let me unpack that for a minute. The social vulnerability approach is typically used by researchers and advocates to study how certain groups, like people with disability, are at greater risk in emergency situations. The social vulnerability approach has some good things about it, like the social model of disability. It helps us to understand the extra challenges and the dangers that people with disability might face in emergency situations. It can really help us to identify the structural barriers and really help us to speak up, particularly as advocates for the removal of those barriers. Structural barriers are things like emergency warning systems that some people can access and other people cannot. It's things like evacuation orders that some people with disability cannot follow, for example, because they have no transportation or an accessible place to evacuate to when an evacuation is ordered. It's things like decisions made without consultation about service continuity planning during emergencies that will have a negative impact on people with disability in terms of accessing supports, supplies, or other things that they need from organizations that they rely on for routine care and support. And the planning that needs to happen to make sure that those services are continuous throughout emergency situations. Structural barriers, importantly, are stigma and discrimination. Because stigma and discrimination are attitudinal barriers, and they serve to exclude people with disability and make them feel like they don't belong in the conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, that itself is the biggest barrier to inclusion and safety in disasters. Other structural barriers are things like not including people in emergency management planning and disaster recovery exercising. When we exclude people with disability, we don't give them an opportunity to think through the process and steps and contingencies they may need to keep themselves safe. And we don't get the benefit of their feedback and input into making our procedures for emergency management better and more inclusive. Another structural barrier might be something like assuming people with disability aren't interested, not able to learn or understand their risks in emergencies. And I think it's really important to call that out as a barrier and make sure we're not assuming that people with disability are uninterested or unable to prepare. So while there's good things about the vulnerability approach, there's maybe some not so good things too. Too often, the vulnerability approach, instead of being focused on identifying and removing those structural barriers, typically gets used to speak about the individual as something being wrong with them, rather than what's wrong with the policy, the practice, or the environments that are excluding people. This leads us to partial solutions. And in the section 2 or part 2 of the DIDRR Framework and Toolkit, I've spent some time talking about the importance of this, because partial solutions are not an effective way to support people with disability and their safety. I've called out a specific one, which is the use of vulnerability registers or lists, otherwise known as vulnerable people's registers, and talked a little bit and gave some information that people can go to understand why registries are not an effective and not an inclusive strategy for people with disability in emergency situations. They're seemingly straightforward, they're seemingly simple, and they're very compelling because it seems like a straightforward way to keep people safe when disasters happen. But as we've shown in our research, particularly in the Victorian context, the only jurisdiction that has a legislated framework for vulnerable registers, this can really result in miss, and flawed information that can confuse rather than keep people safe. Registers are also often based on inaccurate data and inaccurate ideas and assumptions about people with disability, like, for example, that they'll always be at home, and that's where you'll find them in a disaster. This can lead to a false sense of security as well for people with disability. If they think they're on a register and they think that emergency services or police will be able to rescue them, then it might lead to a lack of planning or an ineffective plan or an assumption that someone else has made that plan for them. These superficial planning requirements can tick some boxes, I suppose, but are not a robust way to ensure safety and well-being. And our research has demonstrated routinely that this misinformation about what a vulnerable register is, which is usually the main purpose should be to help people to know a disaster is coming and give them an early warning to help them get to a safe place. But instead, it's really implied that they're a rescue tool. And that is really what keeps people unsafe in a disaster situation. So I really wanted to spend a bit of time to think about that, because the Framework and Toolkit helps us to move beyond registries. Moving beyond registries really means planning with and not for people with disability, supporting people to make an emergency plan that's tailored to their support needs and risk situation. At the organizational level, it's about being informed about the level of preparedness and capabilities of the organizations that provide care and support and services for us. And at the community level, it's about developing comprehensive community profiles that are accurate in their data and particularly accurate in about the support requirements that people with disability need in emergencies. The other thing that can keep people safe in emergencies beyond registries is partnerships. So when government and emergency services partner with our organizations, representative disability advocacy organizations, as well as community services and supports and disability providers, then we can make sure that we're working with aware, capable, and prepared organizations that have both the tangible things, like think about accessible transportation or venues that are accessible or where people feel safe and comfortable and secure. And think maybe about transportation that's accessible for people. We can leverage those tangible assets, but also the intangible assets, like the knowledge and skills and capabilities that these support providers bring, communicating with people, having trusted networks, and supporting effective translation of information through their networks and communities. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we move to part 3 of the framework. And part 3 is really focused on what is this DIDRR framework and how does it actually operate. Next slide, please. Part 3 also talks a lot about what planning with looks like and unpacks a bit more the person-centered emergency preparedness process. Person-centered emergency preparedness, and I'll maybe tell a bit of a story here about how critical that was in our early learning journey, about why the conversation and the tool needed to be in the hands of individuals with disability, and they needed to be leading the conversation. When we started this process, it was usual and typical for community service and disability providers to get worried and concerned about the support needs of people with disability or the people they support in their organizations, and to do something about it. That's a natural human reaction. But our doing something about it often led to developing checklists, creating kind of expert-driven approaches and tools that were not about conversations. They were just about collecting information. And too often, when we revisited those tools and those processes, the information was inaccurate or incomplete. However, when we put the capability wheel, and there's a picture of the 8 elements of the capability wheel on the slide, and we put that in front of participants in the early co-design stages, we saw something really happen and shift in people. It opened up conversations where service providers were no longer ticking boxes, but the conversation and the engagement was in the hands of the individual. They were learning more about the individuals that they support in 20-minute conversations than they had in sometimes 5 months, 3 years, or longer of working with people. The individual had the agency, the choice, and control to drive that process. Whereas when it was more of a checklist approach, the conversation and the tool was always in the provider's hand, and the assumption was that the provider had a plan in place. And like we've talked about before about the risks of registries, that is a risky process for people with disability to assume that someone else has a plan for them. There was another turning point with PSEP, and that was when we partnered with people with disability and their representative organizations to help us co-design and refine the tools. A critical point of PSEP and our reordering of the steps happened when we did that. We learned how critical it was to start with where people are, what are their support needs in everyday life, and move forward in a conversation from the understanding of how people manage every day before they start planning for an emergency situation. That was a game changer, and that led to the person-centered emergency preparedness workbook that probably most of you are most familiar with. And we know and love that because it was designed by people with disability for people with disability. And one of the things I love the most about that is that there's no perfect plan, but there's a lot of great tips and a lot of amazing strategies that come from the perspectives of individuals who develop their own emergency preparedness plans. Next slide, please. Planning with also has to happen at the community level, and we'll talk a little bit about how the disability inclusive emergency planning forums and how you can access information, from those forum results. DIP complements PCEP, importantly, because of step 4. Step 4 of PCEP is about making sure that any unmet needs or any barriers to safety are communicated at the community level and plans put in place. And this is an important bridge that our community organizations can play in translating the risks that people face, their unmet support needs and their support requirements into community level planning, and a critical role for involving community service organizations in that process. Next slide, please. The toolkit is probably richest for you in part 3 and part 4, where we really unpack those tools. And I just wanted to highlight what you might find there. I'll talk a little bit about the individual, the organizational, and community level. There's a section in part 3 that will talk about your responsibility, everyone's responsibility. We need to first prepare ourselves, and then we can do what we can to support and prepare others in our networks. So there's some strategies and key ingredients in the framework and toolkit to help you do that, and make sure that before you start preparing others, you actually take steps to put your oxygen mask on first and be a role model in emergency preparedness planning. Next slide, please. At the organizational level, we've outlined 4 things that these different service providers can do. 4 things that service providers from the community health disability sectors can take, 4 things emergency personnel and volunteers can do, and 4 things that government can do to ensure disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. First, for service providers, develop your own organizational preparedness plans. Build that capacity across your organization and make sure staff and the people you support know what the plan is and is well communicated, and they know what their roles are in that plan. Collaborate, extend outward beyond your organization and collaborate with other community organizations to support and safeguard. See how you can work together to support community level safety for the people that you support collectively. And communicate with government about unmet needs, about risks, about worries. Take on that advocacy role that you're so effective at in your day-to-day work and apply that to emergency management advocacy. Support emergency services and governments to understand those risks and help them to plan better at the community level. For emergency services, our research has shown the most important thing you can do is to listen and learn from the lived experiences of people with disability. When you do that, it will lead logically to one critical action you can take. That is to be really critical of the information you provide. The role of emergency services is to provide risk information and preparedness resources, but that's useless to people with disability if they can't understand, use, and action that information. Develop inclusive community engagement, because emergency awareness and preparedness is not just about giving information and resources or providing resources on a website. It's about having meaningful conversations and personalizing that information to the risk situation of every individual. And yes, that that individualized planning can happen in community forums with groups of people. And it should involve brainstorming with people and their support services together. For government, they have an important key leadership role, fostering and maintaining interagency collaboration among community groups, supporting that collaborative engagement and that peer learning around organizational preparedness, building and developing and tailoring capability across the community for better organizational level preparedness and person-centered planning. Co-designing strategies to remove structural barriers and leaning in to the skills, not just of our emergency personnel, but of our amazing range of community and disability providers and advocates across our community and individuals themselves. And mapping and mobilizing those accessible resources that have been underutilized that are coming from the disability and community sector. Next slide, please. At the community level, our research has revealed clear priorities for action. Here's 6 things that we need to be thinking about doing. So when we think about structural barriers, this is where we can be starting. Create disability inclusive community profiles in our emergency management plans. Use effective data like ABS data to help understand the needs of people across your community. use the lived experience of what those support needs actually involve and entail to inform emergency planning. Support people to have a personal emergency preparedness plan tailored to their support needs and situation. And we've got some great strategies coming out of the work that our Victorian colleagues have done in their emergency planning advice service, where they've embedded person-centered emergency preparedness to tailoring emergency preparedness support in the work of emergency services in partnership with Red Cross. It's been a lovely way to look at how they've done that within their role as an emergency service agency. Then there are key structural barriers around how we communicate information, what options we provide for evacuation, and whether and how transportation options are available. Those are three critical and ongoing challenges that we need to brainstorm and work harder to overcome. And don't forget, it's really important to make sure people with disability are involved in planning and exercising those plans. We won't know if they work effectively unless we try them with people. Next slide, please. Our framework for collaborative action is really going to outline the tools, the people, the focus, and the outcomes, and how we can all work together to contribute to disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. In brief, the triangle on the left shows a simple way of showing the relationship between collaboration, leading through that yellowish arrow to the diamond, which is the outcome. It's a simple way to show the relationship. Next slide. But if we look closely at collaboration, it consists of so many different parts. And to understand and improve our collaboration, we need to consider each of these parts and each of our roles in it. And this includes thinking about the barriers and the challenges we need to overcome. Next slide, please. All of those parts interact. And when collaboration goes well, there's alignment between the parts. And effective alignment in this picture is shown by the straight lines and the straight arrow. Next slide. However, too often, ineffective collaboration is what we might see, feel, or experience. When collaboration does not go well, it can look something like this: squiggly lines instead of straight connections between all of the elements of collaboration, outcomes that go in different directions than we planned or intended. So those bent lines are sort of a representation of that ineffective collaboration. Next slide, please. So the framework for collaborative action talks about the connections between what is my role, what other community participants need to be involved, what will we focus on together, what tools will we use, how will we share responsibility, what will enable and support us to do it, and how can we make sure that people with disability have agency, choice, and control in disaster risk reduction, and are also at the same time safeguarded and protected so that their extra support needs are met in emergency situations. Next slide, please. Part 4 of the framework focuses on the tools. Next slide. And it really focuses on how we use those tools to learn and work together. Tools shape how we work. Tools shape where we focus our attention. Tools help us to sustain our interactions over time, across sectors, and across disciplines. And that becomes central to why these tools are working and the effectiveness of the training that we've built to support and surround those tools. Next slide. Please go online to Collaborating for Inclusion, and we're so proud to be the recipient of the 2023 National Resilient Australia Award for the PSEP certificate course. It's evaluation with significant outcomes, our implementation strategies, and the learning communities that have emerged as a result of learning with communities. Next slide, please. When you visit the website, you can explore the course evaluation to find out who takes the course, what other learners say about it, and what people learn. Next slide, please. When you visit the website and click on the PSEP implementation, you'll be taken to numerous ways of learning about PSEP through webinars, videos, case stories, and different perspectives, how it's been implemented with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, by peer leaders who are leading the charge and supporting that process with each other, and how it's been implemented to support the housing and homelessness sector. Next slide, please. PSEP Connect came about because people wanted more. The PSEP certificate was a great way to learn and develop and change our own behaviors, but changing across sectors at the community level takes more effort and sustained interaction. And PSEP Connect learning communities do that. On this slide, I'm really proud to say that this lives well beyond the research team that simply created a listserv and a way of connecting all of our PCEP graduates, and is now really turning into growing learning communities. Please join us and our colleagues who are leading that charge in regional areas of New South Wales and Western Australia on the 25th of June from 12:30 till 2 o'clock. There's a QR code, and I believe the link will be put in the chat for you to join the celebration and learn more. Next slide. On the website, you can also click onto the Disability Inclusive Emergency Planning page or site. And on the slide, it just gives you an idea of how hard a time we're having keeping up with the numbers of forums. In yellow highlight, I've showed of the 28 forums, we've had nearly 1,000 participants with 235 people with disability, overrepresentation, which is what we aim for, of people with disability having a seat and a voice at the table. And a lot of additional ones labeled in blue along the map of Australia, because we continue to be invited to hold DIP forums across communities. Next slide, please. Important to these forums is hosting by local government. And on this slide is just a sample of the invitations that local governments have created to invite and host multi-stakeholder forums to have these conversations at the community level. And the reports are available from these forums. All of the reports are available on Collaborating for Inclusion. So please do have a look for what's similar, what's different, and how that leads to some of the structural barriers that we've talked about earlier. Next slide, please. You'll also find on Collaborating for Inclusion Emergency Sector Disability Awareness, or ESDA, training. This is training specific to the emergency sector about disability inclusion. It focuses on an introduction to what is disability and why is it important for emergency managers. What is disability advocacy all about, and how do I support and enable that and use the information that comes from advocates? And what is disability representation, and how can it support emergency management planning? So please visit that site. We've had nearly 2,000 completions of that since its launch about 6 months ago. Next slide, please. Part 5 is the rest. Glossary, acronyms, frequently asked questions, and most importantly, perhaps, a long acknowledgement of all of the collaborations and partnerships that have gone into building this framework for action. Next slide, please. I think we're most proud about Australia becoming a global leader in how to do disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And if you ask me what I'm most proud about, it would be that people with disability, the services that support them, government and emergency services from the grassroots, have built tools that work for them and unified their opportunities to work together through tools that they can all use collectively. Next slide, please. And my final message for everyone is to simply start the conversation. And on the final slide, I've left some contact information, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Michelle. A big thank you for all of that work. And look, I'm acknowledging as well, I've been watching the chat during Michelle's presentation. So many of you are having great engagement with the content, and I'm thrilled to see all those clapping hands and hearts. It's such important work. I've been sifting through the questions as they've been coming in. So please don't forget to add a question and to also upvote if you have the ability to do that, so that I can see which questions are the most popular. I'm going to start with a couple and see how we go. There's not enough time to deal with them all. So apologies in advance if I don't ask your question. Look, the first question I want to ask is actually kind of a combination of a couple. People are asking, can this work be expanded? And so I'm going to roll two questions together. Can it be expanded to be about other things other than preparation and planning? And what are your thoughts of that? And can it be expanded to other groups that might have difficulty being engaged with, or be feeling safe and knowing what to do if there is a crisis, or being involved before or after? So we've got people with different languages and all sorts of other groups that this sort of approach might be useful for. So do you want to make any comment or provide a reflection on how this could be expanded, Michelle?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is yes. And to use the voice of my colleagues with disability, when you design with people with disability at the center, you actually end up designing for everyone. And I think we've demonstrated that principle in practice. We've also had the opportunity to collaborate with a number of different organizations, as well as a number of different organizations who've undertaken the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Certificate course and started to implement it in their own practices. And through their voices and perspective, it translates in numerous ways to the sectors and the works and the places that they provide services. One of our, for example, implementation webinars shows a colleague, Jody, down in Victoria, who implemented this with children and families because she works in a children and families services on a one-to-one basis. But there's numerous examples in the implementation webinars where people can see how that applies. And I suppose I should maybe shout out to Tasmania, who've really taken this on board through a 3-year project and are starting to roll this out systematically through collaboration, following the exact same model and procedures, and working to navigate and translate that across the entire state. So stay tuned for their progress.
I've got an interesting question here. I'm going to try and cram a few in. Simon asks a question. I'm curious how you might try to engage with people that may not wish to be vulnerable. And I'm thinking, or be labelled, especially for those who may not appear to have an obvious disability or health issue. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
In fact, in part 4 of the framework and toolkit, you'll notice a simple tweak and change we've made to the capability wheel. In part 4 of the framework document, go to the website to find that. You'll see that we've put the capability wheel and we've removed the word disability. We've just said it helps people to make a tailored plan to their support needs and situation. On the back of that, we've included definitions of each of the elements of the capability wheel, and that's come from feedback from our diverse communities. A good example of that would be older people who might use a walker or have low vision and maybe wear glasses and do not consider themselves to have a disability, and where it didn't resonate for them to use the word disability. So much better to engage simply starting with a cup of tea and the capability wheel as a placemat and conversation starter.
Yeah. Another popular question. It's great to see a focus on reducing risk through such things as a participative preparation process that you've outlined. I'm curious if the reduction of risk to assets comes into play in your work, reducing displacement times, lower cost to repairs, that kind of thing.
These, I think, are all empirical questions that need further study. And I'm really, I must say, I'm really thankful for questions like that and for people who are thinking in that way, because that's about data and evidence that this is working and demonstrable change that we can make in practice. So yes, bring it on, and let's think about how we can move into the future focused on building data-informed evidence of how this operates, the impact that it makes on multiple levels across communities, and showing it in action. I think that's the most, of our DIDR principles in part 2, it's the least developed and the one that our team is, I think I mentioned before, with that arrow into the future, is the one that we have our eye on the prize, focused on building data and evidence about outcomes and impact. And Margaret, you're just frozen on my screen a little bit.
Not going to hear. I'll try that again. Hopefully this comes back. Yes, great. Someone's asked a question about I'm thrown now. And so what I would like to say is that if you go to the website, you will see active engagement from people with disability throughout the entire project. And they're not speaking today, but you will see evidence of that very deep involvement. I apologise that I do appear to be freezing for a couple of people. You will all get a copy of this full webinar, and I'm hoping that that will rectify that. I would like to ask, probably as our perhaps last and final question, I'd like to ask David's question. Hello, David. Loving all the advancements that have been made in this work, has a question though. As the person responsible for managing resilience and disaster preparedness for a business with over 7,000 clients, I'd welcome any thoughts from you, Michelle, about scalability. So is there a magic middle between no planning, which is no good at all, and the huge effort of trying to develop and work with individuals so that they're all prepared and have plans for their own safety, potentially unachievable? Any thoughts about how to find a magic middle?
I really appreciate that question, David, because it comes up routinely. And if you'll permit me to maybe challenge back and say, well, what are the other ways that you could conceive of implementing personal emergency preparedness across an organization? And what ways can the people that you support be actively engaged and involved and part of that process? I think the underutilized resource that is persistent and that you'll see across our projects is the underutilization of individuals with disabilities themselves and their leadership. I'd like to direct people to the peer leadership page and also recognize that that is our clear focus moving forward. I haven't summarized it for this framework and toolkit, but an important part of our work has been working with individuals and disability organizations to explore and understand the transformational leadership approach of involving people with disability in taking charge of their own preparedness plans. And we'll be synthesizing and pulling that information together over the remainder of this year. So please visit back to the website for more information on that count. But also, I think our team would really love to learn from you. A key question we ask at the end of the PCEP certificate is, what's your implementation plan? Given the context where you work, given the challenges, constraints, but also the opportunities and the resources you have at hand, what is the best way for you to support and engage people in your community? And that's really what we want to learn from you as we roll implementation out over the next 3 to 5 years.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm so sorry for everyone who asked a question that I haven't managed to pass forward. We have run out of time. So I would once again like to thank Michelle and her massive team behind her, everyone who's been involved in the project for all of the great work that they've done, and Michelle for speaking to us today. I would also like to thank Nicole, and I thank the AIDR team behind the scenes who are working away to deal with and support the various questions and comments. After the closure of this seminar, and you will all get a recording of the seminar, as I've noticed in the comments, please share as madly, as widely, as passionately as you wish, show as many people as you like. We encourage that. As you exit today's session with Zoom, we do ask you to complete a short survey. We always use feedback from the people who come to our seminars online to help shape and improve our service to all of you. I genuinely thank all of you for coming along. It's been a pleasure to host this afternoon's seminar. And until next time, stay safe and farewell.